The slap echoed louder than the music. For one strange second, nobody in that ballroom moved. Not the caterers carrying silver trays, not the string quartet near the windows, not the 200 guests sitting beneath crystal chandeliers overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Not even me. I just stood there in my white wedding gown with my head turned sideways from the force of Daniel's hand. My future husband had slapped me in front of everyone, and his mother smiled. I still remember the smell of cigarette smoke floating through the ballroom when it happened. Sharp, bitter, thick enough to sting my lungs. I had only asked politely, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." That was it. I said it softly, respectfully. But Daniel suddenly exploded like a man waiting his entire life for an excuse. "Shut up," he shouted. The entire room froze. "You smell worse than cigarettes." Then came the slap. I heard several women gasp. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the dance floor. My cheek burned instantly, but honestly the pain wasn't what shocked me. It was the humiliation. At 42 years old, after 21 years in the United States Navy, after surviving deployments, toxic smoke exposure overseas, and the deaths of men I respected deeply, I had never felt smaller than I did standing there in my wedding dress. And the worst part, a piece of me wasn't even surprised. Because deep down I think I had spent the last 3 years pretending not to see who Daniel really was. 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened, and everything changed. But before I tell you about that moment, you need to understand how I ended up standing at that altar in the first place. My name is Rebecca Lawson. Commander Rebecca Lawson, technically, though most people simply call me Becca. I grew up outside Norfolk, Virginia, in a modest blue-collar family. My father repaired electrical systems at the shipyard, and my mother worked the front desk at a dentist's office for nearly 30 years. We weren't poor, but we counted every dollar. My father believed in 3 things: show up early, work hard, and never complain. The Navy became my path out of a small life. I enlisted at 19. By 25, I was an officer. By 40, I had spent more birthdays overseas than at home. The Navy gave me structure, purpose, and honestly, family. But military life can also leave people lonely in ways civilians don't always understand. Especially women. Especially older women. You spend decades moving from base to base while other people build homes, raise children, host backyard cookouts, and celebrate anniversaries. Meanwhile, you become very good at saying goodbye. I met Daniel Whitmore at a charity fundraiser in Annapolis 4 years before the wedding. He was handsome in that polished East Coast way. Expensive watch, confident smile, tailored Navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He owned a financial consulting company with his cousin. At first, he made me feel admired. After years around military culture where emotions stayed tightly controlled, Daniel felt warm and charming. He brought flowers, opened doors, held my hand in public, and after enough lonely years, that kind of attention can feel dangerous. Looking back now, the warning signs appeared early, very early. The first time Daniel met my Navy friends, he joked, "So which one of you actually does the fighting?" Everybody laughed politely except me. Then there were little comments. "You'd look prettier if you wore your hair longer." "Do you really need to work this much at your age?" A man wants peace when he comes home, not another commanding officer. Most of those comments came from his mother, Linda Whitmore. Linda belonged to one of those wealthy Maryland families that quietly measured human worth through money, appearances, and social status. She smiled often, but never kindly. The first time I visited their waterfront home, she looked at my uniform photo and said, "Oh my, Rebecca, you've certainly lived an unconventional life." Unconventional. That word stayed with me. Linda believed military women were masculine, aggressive, and unsuitable for marriage. She never said it directly. Women like Linda never do. Instead, they poison slowly. Tiny comments over dinner, passive little insults hidden inside compliments. "You're very impressive for someone with such a stressful career." Daniel has always needed softness in a woman. I just worry military life makes people emotionally hard. Daniel never defended me, not once. And somehow I kept excusing it. Because loneliness can make intelligent people tolerate things they normally wouldn't. Especially after 40. Especially after years of watching everybody else build families while you unpack another suitcase alone in another temporary apartment. By the time we became engaged, I already knew something felt wrong. But I convinced myself marriage required compromise, patience, understanding. I told myself Linda would eventually warm up to me. I told myself Daniel's temper came from stress. I told myself many lies. The wedding took place in early October at a historic waterfront hotel in Annapolis. Beautiful weather, cool breeze off the water, golden leaves drifting near the marina. Nearly 200 guests attended, including several Navy officers I had served beside for years. Most of them sat quietly toward the back, because Daniel never liked attention focused on my military career. He once told me tonight is about us, not the Navy. Still, a few came because they loved me. One of them was Admiral Thomas Avery, a respected 2-star admiral nearing retirement. He had mentored me for nearly 15 years. Truthfully, he was more protective of me than Daniel ever was. The reception started smoothly enough. Dinner, champagne, soft jazz music. Then Linda lit a cigarette near the bridal table, inside the ballroom. I noticed immediately because cigarette smoke still affects my breathing after toxic exposure during a deployment years ago near the Persian Gulf. Most people around me knew that. Linda definitely knew. She exhaled smoke slowly while watching me, almost like a test. I tried ignoring it at first, but after several minutes my chest tightened, so I leaned forward gently and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, would you mind smoking outside? My lungs have been sensitive lately." I smiled when I said it. I truly did. Then Daniel stood up so violently his chair nearly fell backward. "Shut up," he barked. The room went silent. "You smell worse than cigarettes?" And then, the slap. I remember the taste of blood inside my mouth. I remember Linda smiling into her wine glass. I remember hearing one elderly woman whisper, "Oh my God." And then, 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened. 12 Navy officers walked inside wearing full dress uniforms, and behind them, Admiral Avery stepped into the room. Daniel's face turned white. The ballroom became so quiet I could hear the water outside hitting the docks below the hotel. 12 Navy officers stood near the entrance in formal dress whites, their medals catching the chandelier light. And behind them stood Admiral Thomas Avery, 6'3", silver-haired, straight posture that somehow made the entire room sit taller the second he entered. I saw several guests immediately recognize the stars on his shoulders. People who had been whispering moments earlier suddenly fell silent. Daniel's face drained of color beside me, because for the first time that evening he realized something important. He had absolutely no idea who I really was. Admiral Avery walked directly toward me without looking at anyone else. Not Daniel, not Linda, not the guests, only me. Every Navy officer in the room stood immediately. A few civilians copied them awkwardly after realizing something serious was happening. The Admiral stopped inches from me and looked carefully at the red mark forming across my cheek. His jaw tightened. "Commander Lawson," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Commander Lawson, not Rebecca, not Becca. My rank, my identity, the one thing I had spent years shrinking to protect Daniel's fragile ego. I swallowed hard before answering. "Yes, sir," but my voice shook slightly. The Admiral noticed. He always noticed. Daniel suddenly forced an uncomfortable laugh. "Admiral Avery, right?" he said, stepping forward too quickly. "I'm Daniel, Rebecca's fiancé." Was. Not fiancé. Not anymore, though I don't think any of us understood that fully yet. The Admiral turned slowly toward him. His expression stayed calm but cold. Very cold. "I'm aware of who you are," he replied. Then his eyes moved briefly toward my cheek again. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like 3 hours. Behind the Admiral, I noticed Commander Elise Monroe standing near the entrance. We had served together overseas years earlier. Beside her stood Captain Raymond Brooks, one of the sharpest logistics officers I'd ever known. These weren't random guests. These were respected officers. People who had spent decades serving this country, and every one of them had just witnessed Daniel slap me. Linda finally spoke, her voice syrupy and fake. "Oh dear, I'm sure this is all just wedding stress." Nobody answered her, not even Daniel. The Admiral looked back at me. "Would you like to step outside for some air, Commander?" The truth is, at that moment I wanted to disappear. Not because of the slap, but because I suddenly saw my entire life from the outside. A 42-year-old Navy commander standing in a ballroom beside a man who had publicly humiliated her. And somehow I had almost married him. I nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." As we started walking, Daniel grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but possessively. "Rebecca," he hissed quietly, "don't make this dramatic." Something inside me shifted when he said that. Because my humiliation wasn't the problem to him. His embarrassment was. I gently pulled my hand away. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to soothe him. The hotel balcony overlooked the harbor. Boats rocked quietly in the dark water below while cold October wind swept across the marina. Admiral Avery stood beside me near the railing. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "I should have said something sooner." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He folded his hands behind his back. "The way that man talks to you." I stared out at the water. "He's not always like that." The Admiral gave me a look older people recognize immediately. The look that says, please don't lie to yourself in front of me. Rebecca, he said gently, I've known you 15 years, and that was true. Thomas Avery had watched me grow from a nervous young lieutenant into a commander trusted during international evacuation operations. He knew me better than most people ever had. He knew about the deployment that damaged my lungs. Kuwait, oil fire smoke and chemical exposure after an attack near one of our temporary operational sites. I spent weeks coughing blood afterward. The Navy covered my treatments quietly, but the damage never fully disappeared. Certain smoke still triggered breathing problems, like cigarette smoke. Linda knew that. Daniel knew that too. Neither cared. You know what bothers me most, I finally whispered. The Admiral waited. I wasn't shocked when he hit me. Saying the words out loud made my stomach twist. Not shocked. Because somewhere deep inside, I think I had spent years preparing emotionally for the day Daniel's temper crossed that line. It hadn't started physically. Men like Daniel rarely begin there. First comes the disrespect, the sarcasm, the small humiliations disguised as jokes. Then isolation. Then emotional control. Then one day the line disappears. I closed my eyes briefly. There were signs, I admitted. The Admiral nodded once. Yes. And strangely, hearing somebody confirm it brought relief instead of shame. Because older women especially are taught to explain away bad behavior. He's stressed. He didn't mean it. He had a rough childhood. You know how men are. But deep down, most women know. I certainly did. I remembered the first deployment Daniel mocked. I had just returned from coordinating civilian evacuations during a dangerous operation overseas. 3 straight days with almost no sleep. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. When I told him how difficult it had been watching terrified families board transport aircraft, he rolled his eyes and said, "You military people always act like you're saving the world." Another time he complained because I missed one of his business dinners during an emergency briefing at the Pentagon. "You care more about strangers than your own relationship," he snapped. At the time I apologized. God help me, I apologized. The Admiral leaned slightly against the railing beside me. "You know why your officers respect you?" he asked. I shook my head faintly. "Because you protect people under pressure." His voice stayed calm. "You walk into chaos and make others feel safe." I looked down at my wedding ring. Suddenly it felt heavy, embarrassing, like a symbol of every compromise I made against my own instincts. Inside the ballroom, music had completely stopped now. Guests were murmuring nervously. I could see silhouettes moving near the windows, watching. The Admiral turned toward me fully. "Commander," he asked carefully, "do you want us to stay?" Not forcefully, not controlling. Just support. Real support. And for the first time all evening, I realized I didn't want Daniel comforting me. I didn't even want him near me. Slowly, I slid the wedding ring off my finger. My hands trembled slightly from adrenaline. Then I looked back toward the ballroom doors, toward the man who slapped me in front of 200 people. And I finally understood something that took me 42 years to learn. Loneliness had made me tolerate things self-respect never should have allowed. I closed my hand around the ring. Then I answered softly, "Yes, sir." The moment I walked back into that ballroom without my wedding ring on, people knew. Nobody needed an announcement. Nobody needed explanations. At my age, you learn people can sense when something permanent has broken. The string quartet had stopped playing completely. Champagne glasses sat untouched on tables. Even the hotel staff looked nervous. Daniel stood near the center of the dance floor, trying desperately to appear calm, while sweat gathered along his forehead. His mother stood beside him, clutching her cigarette with stiff fingers, though she had finally stopped smoking after several guests glared at her. The second Daniel saw me returning with Admiral Avery and the other officers behind me, his expression shifted. The anger disappeared. Now came charm, manipulation, damage control. "Baby," he said quickly, forcing a laugh, "come on, don't embarrass me like this." Embarrass him. That phrase settled into my chest heavier than the slap itself. Not "are you okay?" Not "I'm sorry." Not even I lost control. Just fear about himself. His image. His reputation. I looked around the ballroom slowly. 200 people watching. Some uncomfortable. Some angry. Some pretending not to stare. And suddenly I felt strangely calm. For years I had feared public humiliation. Feared becoming the older woman people whispered about. Feared failed relationships. Feared ending up alone. But standing there in front of everybody, something unexpected happened. I stopped being afraid. Linda stepped forward with a brittle smile. "Rebecca," she said sweetly, "you're upset right now. Let's not ruin the evening over one little misunderstanding." One little misunderstanding. That woman could have watched a house burn down and still called it an unfortunate inconvenience. I looked directly at her for the first time without trying to earn her approval. You smiled when he hit me, I said quietly. Her expression twitched. Only slightly. But enough. Daniel immediately interrupted. Oh my God, Rebecca, stop making this dramatic. That word again. Dramatic. Funny how people always call women dramatic when women finally stop accepting disrespect. I took a slow breath. Then I heard my own voice say something I never imagined saying at my wedding. The wedding is over. Complete silence. Somebody near the back gasped softly. Daniel blinked at me like he genuinely thought he'd misunderstood. What? The wedding, I repeated calmly, is over. Linda laughed once in disbelief. Oh, don't be ridiculous. But I wasn't speaking emotionally anymore. That frightened them more than tears would have. I reached down and placed my wedding ring gently on the bridal table beside the flower centerpiece. No throwing, no screaming, no scene. Just finality. Daniel's face darkened instantly. You're seriously doing this, he hissed. I met his eyes steadily. You slapped me in front of 200 people. You provoked me. There it was. The sentence almost every abusive man eventually says. You provoked me. Several guests visibly reacted to that, especially the older women. I noticed one elderly woman at table 7 slowly shaking her head with visible disgust. Her husband leaned toward Daniel and said quietly but firmly, Son, a real man never hits a woman. Daniel ignored him completely, because men like Daniel never listen once their ego takes over. They only escalate. You think you're perfect? He snapped at me now. You think everybody here doesn't know how cold you are? I stayed silent. He stepped closer. You care more about your Navy career than relationships? Everybody knows it. I almost answered defensively out of habit. Years of habit. Years of explaining myself. But then something inside me simply stopped. Because suddenly I understood no explanation would ever be enough for someone determined to diminish me. The Admiral stepped slightly forward beside me. Not aggressively. Just enough. Daniel noticed immediately. And for the first time all evening I saw fear flicker across his face. Not guilt. Fear. Because now the room no longer saw him as the successful, charming businessman. Now they saw what he truly was, a man who struck his bride in public. And people over 60 especially understand something younger generations sometimes forget. Character eventually reveals itself under pressure. Always. Daniel lowered his voice. Rebecca, he muttered, please don't destroy everything over one mistake. Destroy everything. Again, not concern for me. Concern for himself. His lifestyle. His image. His future. And suddenly I saw our entire relationship clearly. The luxury dinners. The country club parties. The polished photos online. The expensive vacations. Underneath all of it sat one simple truth. Daniel needed admiration more than love. And I had spent years trying to become smaller so he could feel bigger. I looked around the ballroom one last time. The cake. The flowers. The orchestra. Thousands of dollars spent on a wedding that suddenly felt like theater. Then my eyes landed on Commander Elise Monroe near the entrance. She gave me the smallest nod. Not pity. Respect. That nearly broke me emotionally. Because I realized I had received more genuine support from fellow officers than from the man I was about to marry. Daniel reached toward me again. This time I stepped back before he touched me. The movement shocked him. Because I had spent years accommodating him automatically. Apologizing automatically. Softening automatically. Not anymore. I'm leaving, I said calmly. Linda scoffed loudly. Oh, please. Where exactly are you going to go at your age? That sentence hit hard. Not because it was true. Because it revealed exactly how she viewed women. As people who should tolerate misery rather than face solitude. I looked at her steadily. At my age, I said quietly, peace matters more than appearances. For the first time all evening, Linda had no response. I bent down, slipped off my high heels and held them in one hand. The marble floor felt cold beneath my feet as I walked toward the ballroom exit. And strangely, every step felt lighter. Behind me I heard Daniel calling my name. Then louder. Then angrily. But I kept walking. The Navy officers walked beside me silently as we moved through the hotel hallway. Nobody rushed me. Nobody pressured me. Outside, cold autumn air hit my face. I inhaled deeply. And for the first time in years, breathing felt easier than it had inside that ballroom. Then suddenly flashing red and blue lights reflected across the hotel windows. 3 police cruisers pulled into the circular driveway. Daniel stepped outside behind us just as 2 officers exited their vehicles. And the look on his face told me something important. For the first time that night, he understood actions had consequences. The police officers entered the hotel lobby with the calm expression people develop after years of handling domestic disturbances. Steady, professional, unemotional. But the moment Daniel saw them approaching, his confidence cracked. Are you serious right now? He snapped loudly, looking around the crowd. Who called the police? Nobody answered him. One of the officers, a gray-haired sergeant who looked close to retirement age himself, stepped forward calmly. "Sir, we received reports of an assault." Daniel immediately pointed toward me. "She's blowing this out of proportion." Out of proportion. Funny phrase. As if being struck in front of 200 people was a misunderstanding over dinner reservations. The officer looked at me gently. "Ma'am, are you injured?" My cheek still burned. But emotionally I felt strangely detached now, almost exhausted. "I'm all right," I answered quietly. Before Daniel could speak again, a woman near the hotel entrance raised her phone. "I recorded it," she said firmly. Another guest lifted his hand. "So did I." Then another voice. "I saw the whole thing." The atmosphere shifted instantly, because public humiliation works both ways. Daniel had slapped me publicly. Now witnesses existed publicly too. Linda suddenly stepped forward wearing that same polished social smile. "Officers, surely we can handle this privately. Emotions are high tonight." The older sergeant looked at her for about 2 seconds before replying, "Ma'am, assault is assault. Simple. Direct. No performance." Daniel ran both hands through his hair aggressively. "Oh my God," he muttered, "this is insane." But deep down I think he already understood something important. His usual charm wasn't working anymore. Men like Daniel survive through image management, confidence, control. But once enough people witness the truth simultaneously, the mask collapses fast. One officer quietly asked whether I wanted to file an official complaint. I hesitated, not because I doubted what happened, because older generations, especially women my age, were raised to avoid becoming the reason for public scandal, even after being hurt, even after humiliation. We were trained to preserve peace at our own expense. Admiral Avery spoke quietly beside me. "You don't owe anybody silence." That sentence settled deeply into me. You don't owe anybody silence. For years I had confused endurance with strength. But they aren't the same thing. Not even close. I finally nodded. "Yes," I said softly, "I'd like to make a statement." Daniel stared at me like I had betrayed him. Not because he regretted hurting me, because consequences had arrived. So, an hour later most guests had quietly left the hotel. The wedding reception had dissolved into scattered flower petals, abandoned champagne glasses, and exhausted staff members cleaning tables beneath dimmed chandeliers. I sat in a private conference room with a police officer taking my statement while Admiral Avery waited outside. The female officer interviewing me appeared somewhere in her late 50s. Calm eyes. "Wedding ring," gentle voice. When I finished speaking, she closed her notebook slowly and asked, "Has he ever put his hands on you before?" I stared down at the table. "No." Then after a pause, "Not exactly." She waited carefully. There were other things, I admitted quietly. I began describing moments I had buried for years. Daniel grabbing my arm too tightly during arguments, blocking doorways, punching walls, mocking my military service, calling me cold, unfeminine, emotionally damaged. The officer listened without interruption. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I've heard stories like this for 30 years, she said gently. "It almost always starts long before the first slap." That sentence stayed with me. Because she was right. The slap wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. Over the next several days, the fallout spread quickly through Annapolis social circles. Somebody leaked one of the wedding videos online. Not the slap itself at first, just the aftermath. Daniel shouting, me standing silently, Navy officers surrounding the situation. Then eventually the actual video surfaced. I never watched it. I couldn't. But others did. Thousands of others. Veterans groups began sharing outrage online after learning Daniel had struck a senior Navy officer during her wedding reception. Several local news stations contacted the hotel asking questions. Daniel's business partners stopped returning his calls. One investor publicly withdrew from an upcoming development project. And suddenly the same wealthy people who once adored Daniel started distancing themselves quietly. That's another thing older people understand well. Many social circles are built entirely on convenience, not loyalty. Convenience. Linda called me 3 days later. I almost ignored it. But curiosity won. The second I answered, she sighed dramatically. "Rebecca," she said, "haven't we all suffered enough?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "How are you holding up?" Just concern about discomfort. I closed my eyes briefly. "Your son hit me. He was emotional. He assaulted me." Linda's voice hardened immediately. "You humiliated him in front of everyone." There it was again. Not concern for morality. Concern for image. I suddenly understood something chilling about that family. They didn't measure right versus wrong. Only embarrassment versus convenience. Before hanging up, Linda said one final thing. "You never knew how to let a man feel respected." I almost laughed. Because for years I had sacrificed pieces of myself trying to protect Daniel's ego. And it still wasn't enough. Nothing ever would have been. A week later, I drove to visit Margaret Holloway, retired Navy widow. 78 years old, sharp-minded, blunt. She had mentored countless younger military women over the decades, including me. Margaret lived alone in a quiet cottage outside Norfolk with an old golden retriever named Charlie sleeping near the fireplace. She poured coffee into 2 mugs while I explained everything. Not once did she interrupt. When I finally finished, she leaned back slowly in her chair. "Loneliness," she said softly, "can make strong women tolerate weak love." I stared at my coffee silently, because that sentence hit too close to the truth. Margaret studied me carefully. "You spent your whole adult life being needed," she continued. "That kind of life can make being chosen feel more important than being respected." I felt tears threaten my eyes for the first time since the wedding. Not from humiliation anymore, from recognition. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Rebecca," she said, "peace is not loneliness." That sentence changed something inside me, because maybe I had confused the two for years. When I left Margaret's cottage that evening, the sky had already turned dark over the water. I sat inside my car for several minutes before starting the engine. Then my phone rang. "Daniel." I almost declined the call, but something told me to answer. His voice sounded different immediately, less arrogant, more desperate. "There's something you don't know," he said quietly. I frowned. "What are you talking about?" A long silence followed. Then he said, "It's about your father." I didn't speak for several seconds after Daniel mentioned my father. The line stayed quiet except for faint traffic noise somewhere behind him. "What about my father?" I finally asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Can we meet in person?" Every instinct told me not to. But another part of me, the same part that had spent years searching for closure in broken places, needed answers. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a quiet seafood restaurant overlooking the marina in Annapolis. The kind of place older couples visit after church on Sundays. Simple white tablecloths, lemon water, soft Frank Sinatra playing through ceiling speakers. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated in a corner booth. And honestly, he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, no confidence, no polished businessman charm. Just a tired man watching his life unravel. For a brief moment I almost pitied him. Then I remembered his hand across my face, the humiliation, Linda smiling, and the feeling disappeared. Daniel stood awkwardly when I approached. "Thanks for coming." I sat down carefully across from him. "What about my father?" He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I didn't want to tell you this before the wedding." "Tell me what?" He hesitated, then finally said, "Linda hired a private investigator after we got engaged." I stared at him. My stomach tightened immediately. "She became obsessed with your family background," he continued quietly. "She thought your father had hidden debts or gambling problems." I felt anger rise slowly through my chest. "My father worked 38 years in a shipyard," I said coldly. "He died with less than $500 in his checking account." "I know. Then why investigate him?" Daniel looked down at the table. "Because my mother believes poor people are dangerous." The sentence didn't even shock me anymore. It simply confirmed everything I already knew. Daniel swallowed hard. "The investigator found medical records from years ago." I frowned slightly. "What records?" He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "Your father knew your lung damage was getting worse after your deployment." My chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" Daniel leaned forward carefully. "He tried contacting specialists before he died." I stared at him silently, because suddenly memories returned. My father insisting I stop ignoring my coughing. My father asking questions about military hospitals. My father sounding worried during phone calls I barely had time to answer. At the time I thought he was simply being protective. But apparently, it was more than that, Daniel continued quietly. "He spent most of his retirement savings trying to find treatment options for you." I looked away toward the harbor windows. My father had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack. We never got to have one final meaningful conversation. Military life stole too many of those chances. I swallowed carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel's answer came too quickly. "Because I don't want you thinking I'm a monster." There it was. Not remorse. Self-preservation. Again. I looked back at him steadily. "You slapped me in public." His jaw tightened. "You humiliated my mother." I almost laughed at the insanity of that sentence. I asked her not to smoke near my damaged lungs. "She's old-fashioned." "She's cruel." Daniel's eyes hardened slightly. "You always hated her." "No," I said calmly. "I spent years trying to earn approval she never intended to give." That shut him up briefly. The waitress arrived with coffee neither of us touched. Outside sailboats drifted quietly through gray afternoon water. Finally, Daniel leaned back heavily. You know what your problem is, Rebecca? I almost smiled. There it was. The real Daniel returning. My problem. You make people feel small. The sentence lingered between us. And suddenly, I understood him completely. Not just his anger, his resentment, his insecurity, everything. Daniel had never truly loved my strength. He loved being associated with it. The uniform, the status, the discipline, the admiration people showed me. But privately, my accomplishments made him feel inadequate. You know what's ironic? I asked quietly. He frowned. I spent years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. Daniel looked away immediately, because he knew it was true. I continued softly. I apologized for my career, my deployments, my responsibilities, my schedule, my promotions. You were never home, he muttered defensively. I was serving my country. You always chose work first. That sentence used to hurt me deeply. Not anymore. Because older age brings clarity, younger people sometimes lack. People who truly love you don't punish you for your purpose. They honor it. Daniel suddenly leaned forward again. You think another man's going to want this life? He asked bitterly. A woman in her 40s with health problems and military baggage. For years, words like that would have shattered me. Not now, because something inside me had fundamentally changed since the wedding. I no longer feared being alone more than being disrespected. And that changes everything. I stood slowly from the booth. Daniel looked startled. That's it? He asked. I nodded calmly. Yes. You're just walking away. I looked down at him quietly. You already walked away the moment you raised your hand. For once he had no clever response. No manipulation. No charm. Just silence. I left money on the table for my untouched coffee and walked toward the exit. But before I reached the door, Daniel called after me one last time. Rebecca. I turned slightly. And for the first time since I met him, he looked small. Not financially. Not socially. Spiritually. Emotionally. Just small. I did love you, he said quietly. I believed he thought that was true. But love without respect eventually becomes possession. And possession becomes resentment. I gave him a small nod. Then I walked out into the cold harbor air without looking back. Over the following weeks, the consequences continued spreading through Daniel's life. Several investors pulled out of his business ventures completely. The wedding video kept circulating online. Not viral nationwide, but enough. Enough for local damage, enough for whispers at country clubs, enough for people to quietly avoid invitations involving the Whitmore family. 2 former employees even contacted investigators regarding questionable financial practices tied to Daniel's company. Apparently, public exposure has a way of loosening old secrets. Linda reportedly blamed me for all of it. Of course she did. People like Linda never see consequences as the result of behavior, only betrayal. But strangely, none of it brought me satisfaction. Not real satisfaction. Because revenge, I learned, is rarely as healing as freedom. And freedom finally began arriving quietly in my life. Then one afternoon, nearly a month after the wedding disaster, I received a formal envelope from the Navy. Inside was an invitation. A retirement ceremony. Mine. After 21 years of service, the Navy planned to honor my career publicly in Norfolk. I stared at the invitation for a long time. And honestly, part of me considered not going at all. I almost didn't attend my own retirement ceremony. That probably sounds strange after spending 21 years in the Navy, but the truth is, I was tired. Not physically. Spiritually. The wedding disaster had drained something deep inside me. For weeks afterward, I moved through life quietly. I stayed off social media, ignored gossip, avoided unnecessary phone calls. I spent most mornings sitting on the small balcony of my temporary apartment near Norfolk Harbor, drinking coffee while cargo ships moved slowly through the gray Atlantic fog. And for the first time in decades, silence no longer frightened me. It comforted me. That realization alone changed my life, because for years I had mistaken noise for love, attention for connection, endurance for loyalty. The retirement ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Naval Station Norfolk. Simple, traditional, respectful. Exactly the kind of ceremony older military officers appreciate. No unnecessary spectacle, just honor. I almost called to cancel twice that week. Part of me didn't feel worthy anymore after everything that happened. Funny how humiliation works. Even when somebody else hurts you, shame still tries attaching itself to your identity. But on the morning of the ceremony, I received a voicemail from Admiral Avery. Commander Lawson, he said warmly, you showed up for this country for 21 years. Let the Navy show up for you today. So I went. The October air carried that crisp coastal chill Virginia gets near the water. I wore my full-dress white uniform carefully for what would likely be the last official time. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia polished perfectly. When I looked in the mirror before leaving home, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked weak, because I finally looked honest. No pretending, no shrinking, no apologizing. Just me. The ceremony took place inside a modest naval auditorium overlooking the base. Rows of chairs slowly filled with officers, sailors, retired veterans, civilian staff, and a few close friends. Commander Elise Monroe sat near the front. Margaret Holloway came too, walking slowly with a cane beside her golden retriever service dog. Even seeing her there nearly brought tears to my eyes. And then something unexpected happened. People kept approaching me. Young officers, junior sailors, women especially, one after another. A lieutenant shook my hand and said, "You were the first female commander I ever saw leading overseas operations." A young communications officer quietly admitted, "You made me stay in the Navy when I thought I couldn't handle it anymore." Another woman said, "Thank you for proving women don't have to become smaller to lead." I stood there speechless, because for weeks I had focused only on what I lost. The marriage, the illusion, the future I thought I wanted. But I forgot something important. My life had mattered long before Daniel Whitmore entered it, and it would continue mattering after him too. The ceremony itself remained beautifully simple. Admiral Avery delivered the official remarks. He spoke about service, sacrifice, leadership under pressure. Then unexpectedly he paused and looked directly toward me. "There are officers who perform their duties," he said calmly. "And then there are officers who quietly carry other people through difficult seasons of life." The room stayed completely silent. Commander Rebecca Lawson spent 21 years protecting people under pressure without ever asking for recognition. I lowered my eyes briefly, because after everything that happened, being seen kindly again felt overwhelming. The Admiral continued, "She represents something increasingly rare in this world, steady character." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Steady character. Not perfection, not toughness, not achievement. Character. The audience stood for applause when the ceremony ended. Long, warm, sincere. And suddenly I realized something beautiful. The slap at my wedding had not destroyed my dignity. It revealed who never deserved access to it. A few months later, my life looked very different. Quieter. Smaller in some ways. Better in others. I bought a modest little waterfront cottage outside Norfolk with pale blue shutters and an old wooden porch facing the bay. Nothing extravagant. Just peaceful. I planted tomatoes in the backyard. Started taking slow evening walks again. Sometimes I sat near the marina for hours simply watching gulls circle above the water. No chaos. No criticism. No tension waiting beneath conversations. Just peace. And after years inside military structures and emotionally exhausting relationships, peace felt almost sacred. Daniel tried contacting me twice after the retirement ceremony. I never answered. Not from anger, from closure. There was nothing left to discuss. I later heard his business continued struggling after several investigations into financial misconduct expanded. Linda apparently blamed everyone except herself. But honestly, I stopped caring. That surprised me most of all. Because true healing begins the moment revenge stops feeling important. I still think about that wedding sometimes, the music stopping, the slap, the humiliation, the stunned faces around the ballroom. But strangely, those memories no longer feel like the ending of my story. They feel like the beginning of my freedom. And maybe that's the lesson I carry forward now. Sometimes life humiliates us